Hi, I'm Mauri Gandy at JCI Live Austin. Thanks for watching us today. That last video that I showed is called Christmas Mysteries, and it's just amazing to me of why God loves us as individuals so much. And this season of Advent, I'm helping prepare you and your family with stories to enrich your lives and prepare for Christmas. As I told you last week, Advent means to prepare your heart for the coming of Jesus Christ. You know, we watch K-Love, or we listen to K-Love a lot when we're driving in the car, and so many times I hear these stories from the artists about why or how their stories or their songs came about. And so I thought I would start showing some of these videos that they have at K-Love. And today I have the one from Kristen, see if his name is Stanfield, Even So Come, which is also known as Jesus is Coming.
So Even So Come is a song about that day that, as Jesus followers and as God's people, we look ahead to with so much anticipation, and it's that day when Jesus will return.
All of creation, all of the earth.
That's the day that we long for, when every tear will be wiped away and God comes and says, I'm going to make everything new.
Jesus is coming soon.
But that moment is not right now. And I don't know when it will be, and nobody does. And so what do we do right now? Well, we think back on what Jesus said right before he ascended into heaven. He said, go and make disciples of all nations.
Like a bride waiting for her groom, we'll be a church ready for you.
And so we have an assignment. We say, okay, God, I'm still here. Just show me how to walk in your purpose and your plan for my life today.
Even so come.
And he will. He'll meet you there. And it might be going to your job Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. It might be driving your kids around. But even in the middle of that, God has a purpose. He has a plan. God has all of that in his hands for us. And
Even
so that's what the song's about.
Lord Jesus, come.
Yeah, I really like that video. I love songs about Jesus, and this one reminds us that Jesus is coming at any time, and we should have our hearts prepared every day for his arrival, just like we're preparing during the Christmas season here for Jesus to be entered into our hearts every day. So for the events, a lot of parades like Pflugerville and Georgetown and San Marcos got rained out yesterday. When next Sunday on the 11th from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., Jenny Park and Manor will be having their Christmas. Advent reading today is on faith. And I'm going to read, this is my book. It's 25 Days of Advent. I made this book in 2005, and I have an Advent reading every Sunday. And the second week is the faith candle. And usually Advent, we have 3 purple candles and 1 pink. I took the books to my youngest grandchildren to share with them during this Advent season. So tonight we will light the second purple candle. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. Hebrews 11, 1 through 2 is known as the faith chapter. Hebrews 11 is known as the faith chapter in the Bible. Paul writes about the faith of our forefathers, Abraham, Noah, Isaac, Jacob, and other godly men in the Old Testament. In the story of Jesus' birth, we read about Mary, the virgin, that God chose to be the mother to Jesus Christ. She was greatly troubled when the angel appeared to give her the news of being chosen, and she questioned how she could be a mother when she was a virgin. The angel answered, saying, "Nothing was impossible with God." Mary responded with faith, "I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said." Mary loved God, and she trusted him in everything. In Mary's song, Luke 1:46 through 55, she sings, "For the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation." Dear Father God, help us to walk deeply in your faith and give us your direction in our lives. Amen. I found a video just this morning, and I sent it to my son for his family, about the faith chapter of Hebrews 11, and I want to share it with you too. I think it will be great for you to, you can go to YouTube to check it out, and it's on faith.
Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away, for before he was taken he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned," Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Samson, Barak, Jephthah, Daniel, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect.
Video is one I did a couple of years ago about the 25 days of Advent. Hi, I'm Mauri Gandy at Rainbow Castle. This is the December issue. There are great activities to do with your children during the Christmas season. Many years ago, I started a website called Just for Kids magazine, and then in 2000, we started doing Advent lessons. And every year we continue. So for 15 years we've been doing Christmas lessons for children. And in this book that I wrote, 25 Days of Advent, you will find many craft ideas, lessons to do as a family, and also you will find stories. And today I'm going to read some of the stories that I have that either I've written or some famous stories that are just classics at Christmas time. I try to make it easy so that each day you just spend a little bit of time with the kids to prepare their hearts for the coming of the Christ child and to learn the true meaning of Christmas, which is the birth of Jesus Christ. I hope you enjoy today's program and learn some ways that you too, as a parent, can take time this season and teach your children about the birth of Jesus Christ. And if you're watching this and it's already Christmas or just a day before or even after Christmas, we also have 12 days of Christmas, which begins on Christmas Day until January 6th, which is Epiphany, about the three wise men coming to see baby Jesus. So for 12 days, when the kids are home on the holidays, you also have lessons to teach your kids to do great crafts and just to spend quality time with your kids on a very low, if zero, budget. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. So day 4 is D for donkey. Usually I have little donkeys I can give the kids for pictures as part of the nativity, and we talk about the donkey that was part of Mary riding to Bethlehem before she had Jesus. And this next video is day 5 for evergreen, the 3 trees reading. The 5th day of Advent, we talk about the letter E, and we talk about why we have evergreen trees to celebrate Christmas. And one of the stories that I really love to tell at Christmas time is the 3 trees. It's retold by Angela Elwell Hunt. Once upon a mountaintop, 3 little trees stood and dreamed of what they wanted to become when they grew up. The first little tree looked up at the stars twinkling like diamonds above him. "I want to hold treasure," he said. "I want to cover with gold and be filled with precious stones. I'll be the most beautiful treasure chest in the world." And the second little tree looked out at a small stream trickling up on its way to the ocean. "I want to be a strong sailing ship," he said. "I want to travel mighty waters and carry powerful kings. I will be the strongest ship in the world." And the third little tree looked down into the valley below where busy men and busy women worked in a busy town. "I don't want to leave this mountaintop at all," she said. "I want to grow so tall that when people stop to look at me, they will raise their eyes to heaven and think of God. I will be the tallest tree in the world." Years passed. The rains came down, the sun shone, and the little trees grew tall. One day 3 woodcutters climbed the mountain. The first woodcutter looked at the first tree and said, "This tree is beautiful. It is perfect for me." With a swoop of his shining axe, the first tree fell. "Now I shall be made into a wooden chest," thought the first tree. "I shall hold wonderful treasure." The second woodcutter looked at the second tree and said, "This tree is strong. It is perfect for me." With a swoop of his shining axe, the second tree fell. "Now I shall sail mighty waters," thought the second tree. "I shall be a strong ship fit for kings." And the third tree felt her heart sink. With the last woodcutter looked away from her. She stood straight and tall and pointed bravely to heaven. But the woodcutter never even looked up. "Any kind of tree will do for me," he muttered. With a swoop of his shining axe, the third tree fell. The first tree rejoiced when the woodcutter brought him to a carpenter's shop. But the busy carpenter was not thinking about treasure chests. Instead, his work-worn hands fashioned the tree into a feed box for animals. The once beautiful tree was not covered with gold or filled with treasure. He was coated with sawdust and filled with hay for hungry farm animals. The second tree smiled when the woodcutter took him to a shipyard, but no mighty sailing ships were being made that day. Instead, the once strong tree was hammered and sawed into a simple fishing boat. Too small and too weak to sail an ocean or even a river, he was taken to a little lake, and every day he brought in loads of dead, smelly fish. And the third tree was confused when the woodcutter cut her into strong beams and left her in a lumber yard. What happened? The once tall tree wondered. All I ever wanted to do was to stay on the mountaintop and point to God. Many, many days and nights passed, and the three trees never forgot their dreams. But one night, golden starlight poured over the first tree as the young woman placed her newborn baby in a feed box. I wish I could make a cradle for him, her husband whispered. The mother squeezed his hand and smiled as the starlight shone on the smooth and sturdy wood. This manger is beautiful, she said, and suddenly the first tree knew he was holding the greatest treasure in the world. And one evening, a tired traveler and his friends crowded into an old fishing boat. The traveler fell asleep as the second tree quietly sailed out into the lake. Soon a thundering and thrashing storm arose, and the little tree shuddered. He knew he did not have the strength to carry so many passengers safely through the wind and rain. And the tired man awakened. He stood up, stretched out his hand, and said, "Peace." The storm calmed as quickly as it had begun. And suddenly the second tree knew he was carrying the King of Heaven on earth. One Friday morning, the third tree was startled when her beams were yanked from the forgotten woodpile. She flinched as she was carried through the angry, jeering crowd. She shuddered when the soldiers nailed a man's hands to her. She felt ugly and harsh and cruel. But on what? Okay. I guess it's froze on us. So I just finished my newest book, God's Kingdom at Rainbow Castle, which is available.
This hearing will come to order.
Magazine. So now we're going to have a few news here for Ted Cruz at the Senate floor. He participated just yesterday at the Border Security Roundtable with local law enforcement officers and elected officials in McAllen, Texas, on Friday, December 2nd. Senator Cruz was briefed on immigration enforcement efforts and top border security issues. And then on Thursday, December 1st, Senator Cruz held an Artificial Intelligence Senate subcommittee hearing, and I just have a short clip on that.
This hearing will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to each of the witnesses. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone for attending this hearing. Throughout history, mankind has refused to accept the complacency of the status quo and has instead looked to harness creativity and imagination to reshape the world through innovation and disruption. The Industrial Revolution, Henry Ford's moving assembly line, the invention of flight and commercial aviation, and more recently, the creation of the Internet, have all acted as disruptive forces that have not only changed the way we live, but have been engines for commerce that have offered consumers enormous freedom. Today, we're on the verge of a new technological revolution, thanks to the rapid advances in processing power, the rise of big data, cloud computing, mobility due to wireless capability, and advanced algorithms. Many believe that there may not be a single technology that will shape our world more in the next 50 years than artificial intelligence. In fact, some have observed that as powerful and transformative as the Internet has been, it may be best remembered as the predicate for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Artificial intelligence is at an inflection point. While the concept of artificial intelligence has been around for at least 60 years, more recent breakthroughs, such as IBM's chess-playing Deep Blue victory over world champion Garry Kasparov, advancements in speech recognition, the emergence of self-driving cars, and IBM's computer Watson's victory in the TV game show Jeopardy have brought artificial intelligence from mere concept to reality. Whether we recognize it or not, artificial intelligence is already seeping into our daily lives. In the healthcare sector, artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to predict diseases at an earlier stage, thereby allowing the use of preventative treatment which can help lead to better patient outcomes, faster healing, and lower costs. In transportation, artificial intelligence is not only being used in smarter traffic management applications to reduce traffic, but is also set to disrupt the automotive industry through the emergence of self-driving vehicles. Consumers can harness the power of artificial intelligence through online search engines and virtual personal assistants via smart devices, such as Microsoft's Cortana, Apple's Siri, Amazon's Alexa, and Google Home. Artificial intelligence also has the potential to contribute to economic growth in both the near and long term. A 2016 Accenture report predicted that artificial intelligence could double annual economic growth rates by 2035 and boost labor productivity by up to 40%. Furthermore, market research firm Forrester recently predicted that there will be a greater than 300% increase in investment in artificial intelligence in 2017 compared to 2016. While the emergence of artificial intelligence has the opportunity to improve our lives, it will also have vast implications for our country and the American people that Congress will need to consider moving forward. Workplaces will encounter new opportunities thanks to productivity enhancements. As artificial intelligence becomes more pervasive, Congress will need to consider its privacy implications. There is also a growing interest in this technology from foreign governments who are looking to harness this technology to give their countries a competitive advantage on the world stage. Today, the United States is the preeminent leader in developing artificial intelligence. But that could soon change. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, "The biggest buzz in China's internet industry isn't about besting global tech giants by better adapting existing business models for the Chinese market. Rather, it's about competing head-to-head with the U.S. and other tech powerhouses in the hottest area of technological innovation, artificial intelligence. Ceding leadership in developing artificial intelligence to China, Russia, and other foreign governments will not only place the United States at a technological disadvantage, but it could have grave implications for national security. We are living in the dawn of artificial intelligence, and it is incumbent that Congress and this subcommittee begin to learn about the vast implications of this emerging technology to ensure that the United States remains a global leader throughout the 21st century. This is the first congressional hearing on artificial intelligence, and I am confident it will not be the last, as this growing technology raises opportunities and potential threats at the same time. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of experts today, and at this point I'll yield to our subcommittee's ranking member, Senator Peters, to give an opening statement.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
And finally, on November 30th, Senator Ted Cruz at the Senate floor talked about the Castro's death, and that's our last video. And join us again next Sunday at 1 o'clock.
Fernando Valladares, the Cuban dissident and poet who was imprisoned for 22 years under the Castro regime, who so powerfully observed in his memoir, "My response to those who still try to justify Castro's tyranny with the excuse that he has built schools and hospitals is this: Stalin, Hitler, and Pinochet also built schools and hospitals. And like Castro, they also tortured and assassinated opponents. They built concentration and extermination camps and eradicated all liberties, committing the worst crimes against humanity. Mr. President, this week we witnessed a powerful moment for people all across the country, and especially for Cuban Americans like myself. Cuba's longtime oppressive dictator, Fidel Castro, is dead. Let me be absolutely clear. We're not mourning the death of some revolutionary romantic or a distinguished statesman. We're not grieving for the protector of peace or a judicious steward of his people. Today we are thankful. We are thankful that a man who has imprisoned and tortured and degraded the lives of so many is no longer with us. He has departed for warmer climes. This brutal dictator is dead. And I would like to pay tribute to the millions who have suffered at the hands of the Castro regime. We remember them, and we honor the brave souls who fought the lonely fight against the totalitarian communist dictatorship imposed on Cuba. And yet at the same time, it seems the race is on to see which world leader can most fulsomely praise Fidel Castro's legacy while delicately averting their eyes from his less than savory characteristics. Two duly elected leaders of democracies who should know better, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and American President Barack Obama, had been leading the way. Mr. Trudeau praised Castro as a, quote, larger-than-life leader who served his people for almost half a century, and a, quote, legendary revolutionary orator who, quote, made significant improvements in the education and health care on his island nation. Tell that to the people in the prisons. Tell that to the people who have been tortured and murdered by Fidel Castro. Mr. Obama likewise offered his, quote, condolences to the Cuban people and blandly suggested that history will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure. Now, he added, we can, quote, look to the future. What is it about young leftists? What is it about young socialists that they idolize communist dictators who torture and murder people? Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and all of their goons are not these sexy, unshaven revolutionaries in college dorm rooms on posters that make leftists go all tingly inside. They were brutal monsters. And we should always remember their victims. Earlier this week, I publicly called that no United States government official should attend Castro's funeral unless and until his brother Raul releases the political prisoners. First and foremost, those who have been detained just since Fidel's death. Unfortunately, in this administration, my call went unheeded. Two high-level U.S. government officials attended Fidel's memorial service yesterday. This unofficial delegation included Ben Rhodes, Assistant to the President, Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, and Jeffrey de la Rontas, a top U.S. diplomat, the top U.S. diplomat in Cuba. Yesterday, when asked about a U.S. presence for the memorial service, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said, quote, we believe that this was an appropriate way for the United States to show our commitment to the ongoing future-oriented relationship with the Cuban people. And, quote, "This is an appropriate way to show respect, to participate in the events that are planned for this evening, while also acknowledging some of the differences that remain between our two countries." I'm afraid I must ask Mr. Ernest, were any of these, quote, differences publicly acknowledged while Rode and De Laurentiis were commemorating the legacy of Fidel Castro? How exactly do you commemorate it? Cheers to the tyrant? I suspect those, quote, differences were not mentioned in the funeral pamphlet. Mr. Ernest also claimed last night that, quote, "Certainly no one from the White House and no other delegations will be sent to Cuba to participate in any of the other events." Well, that's comforting. Mr. President, let's hold him to those words. My hope and prayer is that these officials do not attend the funeral. Although I must say, it's quite convenient that Rhodes had a pre-planned trip to Cuba this week. Ernest remarked that, quote, "Mr. Rhodes has played a leading role in crafting the normalization policy that President Obama announced about 2 years ago, and that he has been the principal interlocutor with the Cuban government from the White House in crafting this policy and implementing it successfully." Well, I suppose it is appropriate that the federal government official who played an integral role in allowing billions of dollars to flow to Cuba, to flow directly to Raul and Fidel Castro, be there to commemorate Fidel's death. Billions of dollars that have gone to strengthen the repressive machinery, to strengthen the regime. You know, if a United States company or European company wants to hire a Cuban worker, they can't do it. It's against the law. It's unlike many other countries, unlike China, other places where you can hire a local worker. Instead, you must hire the government. There is one and only one person you can hire. Is the foreign companies pay the Cuban government. And the Cuban government, in its benevolence, keeps 93 cents of every dollar and pays the Cuban workers 7 cents out of every dollar. 93 cents of every dollar of the billions that Barack Obama has funneled to Castro have gone to the government of Raul Castro and Fidel Castro to fund the secret police, to fund the prisons, to fund the torture. Or our diplomatic brigade pats themselves on the back as to what enlightened diplomats they are. The life and legacy of Fidel Castro is no cause for celebration or commemoration. His contributions consist of a ruined country and a broken people. You know, Cuba is almost like the land that time forgot. You can go and see cars from the 1950s, meticulously maintained, held together almost with rubber bands and chewing gum. Now, it's not that the citizens there have a fondness for antiquities. It's that the repressive communist economy has trapped them, has mired them in poverty, where 1950s cars are all they've got. Where the last 60 years didn't happen other than the jackboot of the oppressive police state. And I'll point out, on this issue, I'm not a disinterested observer. My own family's experience has been acute. My father, born and raised in Cuba, fought in the revolution, initially believed in the principles of freedom that he thought the revolution was about, fought against Batista, a cruel dictator, and was tortured and imprisoned by Batista's police state. And then my aunt, my tia Sonia, younger than my father, stayed and was there after the revolution occurred and suddenly discovered the revolution was based on a lie. The kids who thought they were fighting for freedom discovered instead an even worse tyrant than that who preceded him, a communist dictator who would line up dissidents and shoot them. My tia Sonia participated in the counter-revolution. She fought against the Castro tyranny. And I'll tell you, when she was a high school girl, she and her two best friends were arrested, were thrown in prison by the Castro regime. And like her brother, she faced terrible treatment in a Cuban prison. What they did in Cuban jails to teenage girls should not happen to anyone. This is the legendary figure that Trudeau and Obama celebrate. The night that the news broke that Castro had died, I received a text from my cousin Bibi, my tia Sonia's daughter, and someone who I grew up with like a sister. And Bibi texted me, she said, "Fidel Castro is dead. I am glad that I was able to make that call to let my mother know." I imagine when Bibi called my tia Sonia, it was an extraordinary moment. My aunt was asleep at the time. And Bibi sent me a second text. I couldn't help to think about all the conversations at the dinner table with abuelo and abuela, my grandparents, about the day that Castro dies. You know, texts just like that, millions of people sent all over the world, especially in the Cuban-American community. People have dreamed for years, for decades, about the day this tyrant would die and face eternal judgment. The betrayal, brutality, the violence experienced by my father, by my aunt, were all too typical of the millions of Cubans who have suffered under the Castro regime over the last 6 decades. This is not the stuff of Cold War history that can be swept under the rug simply because Fidel is dead. Consider, for example, the dissidents Guillermo Fariñas and Elizardo Sanchez, who came to the United States. I had the opportunity to sit down and visit with them both, to interview them both. And they warned me in the summer of 2013 that the Castros, then on the ropes because of the reduction of Venezuelan patronage, were plotting to cement their hold on power by pretending to liberalize in order to get the American economic embargo lifted. Their model was Vladimir Putin's model, his consolidation of power in Russia. Indeed, Sanchez called it Putinismo. And their plan was to get the United States to pay for it. Well, sadly, it worked. The year after I met with Fariñas and Sanchez, Mr. Obama announced his famous, quote, thaw with the Castros, and the American dollar started flowing. As we now know, there was no corresponding political liberalization, simply American dollars funding a brutal dictatorship. Last September, Mr. Fariñas concluded his 25th hunger strike against the Castros' oppression. Then there is the case of prominent dissident Oswaldo Paya, who died in 2012 in a car crash that is widely believed to have been orchestrated by the Castro regime. His daughter, Rosa Maria, has pressed relentlessly for answers on her father's apparent murder, and thus she's become a target herself. Just 3 years after her father's death, the Obama administration honored the Castros with a new embassy in Washington, D.C. And at the launch of that embassy, Rosa Maria tried to attend the State Department press conference as an accredited journalist. But she was spotted by the Cuban delegation, who demanded that she be removed if she dared to ask any questions. The Americans complied in an act of thuggery more typical with Havana than Washington. What does it say of John Kerry and the State Department? What does it say of the Obama administration that when a communist tyrant, when their police force says there is a dissident, a journalist who might ask inconvenient questions, will you silence her and muzzle her? The response from the Obama administration is only too happy to comply. No inconvenient questions about the apparent murder of your father. We've got different priorities. Last summer, I had the honor to meet with Dr. Oscar Bisset, an early truth teller, about the disgusting practice of post-birth abortions. I want you to think about that concept for a second. Post-birth abortions, otherwise known as the murder of infants. That are far too widespread in Cuba. Dr. Bisset has been repeatedly jailed and tortured for his fearless opposition to the Castros. I asked him, as I had Mr. Fariñas and Mr. Sanchez, whether his ability to travel, did it signal a growing freedom on the island? He answered just as they had 3 years earlier, no. In fact, he said, the repression had grown worse since the so-called thaw. Didn't we realize, he asked me, that all those American dollars were flowing to the Castros' pockets and funding the next generation of their police state? That's the true legacy of Fidel Castro, that he was able to institutionalize his dictatorship so that it would survive him. Fidel Castro's death cannot bring back the thousands of victims, nor can it bring lasting comfort to their families. For 60 years, Fidel Castro systematically exploited and oppressed the people of Cuba. And now that tyrannical reign has fallen to his brother Raul, every bit as vicious as Fidel was. I was with my father shortly after he found out the news that Fidel Castro was dead. I asked my dad, what do you think happens now? And my father shrugged and said sadly, not much of anything. Raul has been in power for years now. The system's only gotten stronger. What Obama has done in funneling billions of dollars to the Castro is strengthened tyranny just 90 miles from our shores. And those billions, those American dollars, are being used to oppress dissidents. In 2016, roughly 10,000 political arrests occurred in Cuba. That's 5 times as many as occurred in 2010. What does it say about President Obama's foreign policy that under him political arrests have increased to 500% where they were just 5 years ago? This tyrannical regime has gotten stronger because of a weak president and a weak foreign policy. And there's a real danger that will now fall into a trap of thinking that Fidel's death represents material change in Cuba. It does not. The moment to exert maximum pressure would have been 8 years ago, when Fidel's failing health forced him to pass control to his brother Raul. But rather than leverage the transition in our favor, the Obama administration decided to start negotiations with Raul in the mistaken belief that he would prove more reasonable than his brother. An unfortunate pattern this administration has repeated with Kim Jong-un, with Hassan Rouhani, and Nicolas Maduro. They don't seem to learn the lesson about the brutality of tyrants. The administration lifted the embargo that had been exerting economic pressure and having real meaningful effect. Efforts to be diplomatically polite about Fidel's death suggest the administration still hopes that Raul can be brought around. All historical evidence points to the opposite conclusion. Raul is not a different Castro. He is his brother's chosen successor who has spent the last 8 years implementing his dynastic plan. Unlike Cuba, however, the United States has an actual democracy. And our recent election suggests there is significant resistance among the American people to the Obama administration's pattern of appeasement and weakness towards hostile dictators. We can, we should, and we are sending clear signals that that policy of weakness and appeasement is at an end. Among other things, we should halt the dangerous, quote, security cooperation we have begun with the Castro regime, which extends to military exercises, counter-narcotics efforts, communications, and navigation, all of which places our sensitive information in the hands of a hostile government that would not hesitate to share it with other enemies from Iran to North Korea. I hope all my colleagues will join me in calling for these alterations. The communist dictator Raul Castro is not our friend, and we should not be sharing military secrets in military cooperation with his military only to have those used against us. A dictator is dead, but his dark, repressive legacy will not automatically follow him to the grave. Change can come to Cuba, but only if America learns from history and prevents Fidel's successor from playing the same old tricks. It is very much my hope and belief that with a new president coming into office in January, President Trump and a new administration, that U.S. foreign policy, not just to Cuba, but towards our enemies, whether they be Iran or ISIS or North Korea, will no longer be a policy of weakness and appeasement, but instead using U.S. strength to defend this nation and to press for change. This ought to be a moment where Cubans are dancing in the street because they are being liberated. But instead, if you dance in the street right now, you're going to be thrown in jail. Obama is sending his condolences to the Cuban people on the passing of a dictator who's imprisoned and tortured and oppressed them for 60 years. You know, those are condolences they can do without. Cuba is not a free society. You aren't allowed to speak or worship freely. They tear down churches. They repress the most basic liberty to worship God. We need leadership to prompt real and meaningful change in Cuba. Valladares wrote in his memoir, the mass execution was ordered by Raul Castro and attended by him personally. Nor was it an isolated instance. Other officers in Castro's guerrilla forces shot ex-soldiers en masse without a trial, without any charges of any kind lodged against them, simply as an act of reprisal against the defeated army. Mr. President, I've never been to my father's homeland. I've never been to Cuba. My father has not returned to Cuba in 60 years, over 60 years. I look forward to one day visiting Cuba, hopefully with my dad, my tia Sonia, my cousin Bibi, and seeing a free Cuba where people can live according to their beliefs without fear of imprisonment, violence, or oppression. But, Mr. President, under the dictator Raul Castro, today is not that day. The people of Cuba need to know that there are still those in America who understand that and who stand with them, not the corrupt and vicious crime family that has oppressed them for so long, that has enriched themselves, accumulating millions and millions of dollars in personal wealth, living like emperors and kings while they've oppressed the people of Cuba. You know, those in Hollywood, those in the academy, those in the Obama administration, they think that communism is about equality. There is nothing equal about Cuban communism other than equality of suffering, other than equality of misery, other than equality of hopelessness. The Cuban communist regime, the army acts as the enforcers for the dictators who live opulent lifestyles while oppressing the masses. There's a word for that. It's called evil. It's not simply an interest.